Objective this evening is somewhat to say that wherever your journey takes you, you'll be in an organization or a group. There's going to be rules that you know about, and there's going to be unwritten rules that are vague, expectations of you. Some of them are going to be expectations of your professional knowledge, and some will be expectations of your social skills. In your assignments, you may find out the rules don't really help fully. They may be incomplete. You may need to generate standards or rules. In other cases, there may be situations where the rules are stuck and they force you into a path that is not really what your assignment you can be fruitful at. So I am going to be talking about GLP. And let me, is it in the view mode? I'll figure it out. I'm going to be talking about GLP, GMP, connected with the ISO 9000 and other complaint systems that some of you may know about. I may use terms that are different than your own, so please, if I use a term that doesn't connect to what one of the literature articles are said or whatever, please let me know and I'll try and explain it. But again, my intention really here is to say, you're in the middle of a situation, you begin an assignment, and your job is going to be to meet that mission. And I'm going to use a military analogy. There's a chain of command, there's a hierarchy, you're supposed to obey orders, but you're also supposed to show initiative when facing unexpected events. You're not supposed to be slavish to orders if the situation doesn't allow for it. And that's where you may have to make decisions, and you may have to gain allies and colleagues to agree with you that something new is needed or different or whatever. So my background is 20 years in specialty chemical industry. I worked for Betts Labs and Trevos, as we used to say, Trevos. Right now it's owned by GE, they're selling it. I was in scale and corrosion control, distillation towers, boilers, cooling towers, so I know water treatment. And some of my GLP discussion will be on water analysis as well as the more medical or FDA type development. Merger, downsizing, I had to look for another job. Please don't expect to work 30 years in one place. I ended up working for a German firm on a product that had been around since the 1930s and 1940s, but which was given a new name, nanoparticle, or nanomaterials, in the early 2000s. So I represented a body of knowledge in various institutional settings, the ISO area. I'm participating with Professor Koo in the Nano Working Group. I've continued these interests after I left the industry. I'm a consultant for the University of California Center for Environmental Environmental Implications of Nanotechnology, where I help them gain stakeholders to come to their meetings. It's very difficult for academics to get industry people to show up. It's even more difficult for them to get NGOs to show up. It turns out I know the NGOs better because industry people meet the NGOs more often than academics. So I became this person who brought in stakeholders. And Nanophase is a European FP7 project that I'm on the advisory board. So I'm caught up in that area of, shall we say, semi-retired, able to use my experience appropriately, and I have a balance of those sorts of items. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach. For example, I don't think that GLP is for objectivity. I think it's to prevent fraud. Picks up the verification element. Once you're in the non-fraudulent area, now you have an objectivity issue, which is what Professor Koo is saying, but there's certain elements. So I want to go to the conventional view of science because some of what's involved with GLP means you may go before a courtroom, there will be a jury, and what GLP has to make sense to is a really smart judge, but they may not know science, but a jury that has to say that was in evidence. Evidence is different than data. So that was evidence. So the conventional view of science is you've got a hypothesis, you're going to test the hypothesis, you're going to evaluate the results. There's a whole STS sociology theory that you actually don't want to prove the hypothesis, you want to disprove it. If you can't disprove it, that makes the hypothesis stronger. There's an area of patent law where a company may ask for its own patent to be re-examined so that they still have it, but every time your patent has been re-examined, it has a higher stature. and you're able to police it more effectively. So that's that falsification approach. And then they'll say you refine the hypothesis. I don't think that's my experience. My experience is more incremental advancement. It's not really create hypotheses. But I do have to note that when we publish in journal articles, that's sure how we make it look. You go to the introduction of a journal article, they're going to give you context, and they're also going to explain the question to be examined, the hypothesis. They test the hypothesis, you'll find that in the materials and methods section. They'll get results, results are results. They'll evaluate the results, that's usually in the discussion section. And they'll say whether or not the question was answered properly. Refine a hypothesis, it may occur in the conclusions. You'll start seeing speculations. That's the next hypothesis. And you have to realize what you read was done probably 1.5 years to 2 years ago. So that person's probably working that already. So don't start now because you'll be outdone by the next publication before you get around to doing your work.
I'd like to say bye and thank you so much. By the way, everything is so much more messy than what we tell you. Everything. However, there is a method to this madness, and standardization is part of that.
Right.
So thank you so much, and we will see you. Okay.
Any news from the international meeting with Trump travel ban?
It was extraordinary. That's why I was a little late. Next time, we take like 5-10
Yeah.
minutes. Are there any international students here?
Yeah, a few of them, actually.
Yeah. Well, maybe they want to know. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
My background is more incremental. I use different categories than is maybe perhaps traditional. I think you do exploratory research where there aren't many rules, and you're going to have to develop some structure to how you do your work. There's normal science, that's an STS term. That means that your paradigm, your basic structure is pretty well known, and you maybe are filling in blanks or new materials, but within a known way of measurement. Two areas that are not usually discussed, methods development. These are people coming up with tests. Usually you use a test, you publish, you move on, but methods development person, usually analytical chemistry in my background, is going to say, this has to be a reliable test. I have to show what its parameters are, whether it works. I have to be able to say it's useful. They're worried about the test. The test may allow them to have accelerated knowledge in exploratory or normal science, but if you think of liquid chromatography, HPLC, these are expansions of a capability that are going to be used in other purposes, but they have their own method to them. And the last one is quality control. My first job was a quality control chemist. Repetitive testing is definitely there, usually to use in terms of monitoring a process or some other activity that's going on. But I also have to say, I put NIST in that category. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, they're actually giving you calibration materials. They call it a reference material, but it's a calibration. If you can't measure Planck's constant, maybe the constant doesn't exist the way you think. And my professor at RPI who did gas kinetics was an older German gentleman, and he said, oh, you have it so easy. Planck's constant is constant. Turned out that Avogadro's number and Planck's constant had moved by 15% during his career, and he always had a problem wondering whether, is this the original number I was taught, or is this the newest number? So that accuracy thing. I'm not a believer in the linear model, which is fundamental research, then applied research, then commercialized and diffused. To me, I have an assignment. If I happen to work in an academic lab, it's still assignment. I'm going to do something. I have to structure it. I may say it's fundamental to everybody else, but actually it's exploratory research in an area that hasn't well established yet. I may say it's hypothesis driven, but that's just me saying what my rules are going to be as I explore this area in order to be fruitful. Now, why I mention this is there was a scandal at the FDA in the early 1970s. IBT was the name of the company, but it looked like a lot of data they'd received was fraudulent data, not well done. There was skepticism developed towards any industry study. Think of the tobacco industry and the tobacco industry's research. Skepticism well deserved. There actually became a decreased funding for industrial research, because if you're not going to be believed, why do you pay for your own tox people? Haskell Laboratories, which was a stalwart tox group at DuPont, has been disbanded. They were one of the last of the industrial tox laboratories. Now, I'm more of an EPA than I am FDA. It started in the FDA. They certainly picked up the activities in the OECD. One difference I would have with your presentation is OECD members are countries, not people. I mean, the State Department runs the OECD, and if an FDA topic comes up, the State Department says, Mr. FDA or Dr. FDA, please come to it, but it's a treaty organization. And so that's why they have a different approach than some of the standards organizations do. But anyway, the EPA and others introduced good laboratory practice to supplement their own protocol. It applies to all testing. This is a legal thing. It applies to water quality tests. So has someone been discharging a toxicant, or they're over their copper discharge limit at a facility on the Ohio River? They have to be certain the data would make it to a court of law and be considered evidence. So water quality testing is done by GLP. Chemical registration, the area that I know fairly well, by GLP. And what happened is they created an expanded role in market for contract research organizations. These are the third-party groups that do the testing. So they began approaching it, they had a need, and their starting point was the conventional approach to science. So you have a question, that's the hypothesis. They insist on test samples being well-defined, and controls, meaning what you're comparing them to, standardized protocol, materials and methods. They discuss the results, and then you're supposed to write a commentary on any deviations you had to make from the protocol or from the test sample, so that you can say it's still a good test, but I did have to make some deviation. It's the discussion section. And then they had to add legalities to make it enforceable. So I'm going to draw ISO 9000 analogy. I don't know if your co-op experience or people have worked in it, but ISO 9000, you said you were a quality distributor? Yeah. ISO 9000 is a quality system. It was introduced in the 1990s, late 1980s. A lot of companies will tell you they're ISO 9001 or whatever type of standardization. I'm going to use this because you might experience this more earlier in an industrial career than you will GLP. But basically, the ISO 9000 analogy is you write down what you do. You write down what you do what you write down, and then you're audited. So what happened here is on multi-site facilities, you'll often find that everyone says they're doing the same thing, but when you make them sit down and write down what they do, you find out they all do something differently. They add the chemicals in a different order of addition, or they do something like that where you say, well, that's not exactly what you're doing the same thing. So in an ISO 9000 process, people usually find out they should be more consistent. Then you make them do what was written down, and then you have regular audits. But now the question is, how do you ensure compliance? Well, I'm going to take the complaint journey a little bit more detailed. The ISO 9000 covers all things about raw materials and how you operate the plant as well. But what do you do during a complaint? And my experience has been that customer complains, you obtain a retain sample. Most companies retain a sample from every production lot. It's stored for a certain amount of time. You redo the QC test, you check against the certificate of analysis, you guarantee the customer, this is the test for that lot. You compare it to specifications. It may be the customer says, I don't care, still got a problem? Well, then you may get the customer to send you a sample from that lot back. You go through it. Then maybe you look at production logs, and you have your customer look at their production logs to find out if you can see there's a problem, despite the fact it's nominally the same. Maybe there's something different. And then you resolve what the issue is, and you do your corrective action. That's what the auditor is going to do. They're going to check whether or not you had corrective actions. Did you do your corrective actions? And did you follow this process?
So they check paperwork or they check the actual action?
The corrective actions would be that you said you were going to do something, and then they would say, did you actually do it? So did you change your process? Did you guarantee the customer that for them you're going to package it in 3-ply bags rather than 2-ply bags? Would you get it to them, would you hold a retained sample for 2 years rather than 1 year, whatever your official standard procedure is you may make an adjustment for them. How do you ensure compliance? What ISO 9000 did is, they said, we want a management statement. We want your CEO to write down, I'm committed to this program. We want a corporate quality officer or someone in that quality position to actually lead the effort of writing down what you do. And then that person later writes the status reports that we do what we wrote down. The lab director assures lab operation. The lab technician, never mentioned in any of the historical journals, but the lab technician's the one who probably does it. And then you have the internal auditor look this over. So you would say, we had the management commit to doing a process. The auditor says you are or you are not complying with the process that you said you were doing. See, it's a little bit of a closed circuit there. So now let's go to GLP. There's a formal request. I come to a contract research organization, I need a certain test done, a study done. There's a study director, starting to see the people getting involved with the process. There's a principal investigator assigned. Secured sample, that's the legal aspect. Not any sample. You watch Law and Order like I do at times, the property room. You have a place where you put the sample. Only people who sign can take the sample out. They can only take it out for a certain purpose. They have to return it. There's a log. The log is audited. You have to study, conduct the study using the proper protocol. The statistics of the study have to make sense. In water quality, every 10th sample has to be a known so that you can say your equipment was aligned, your study was aligned, this was the answer. Signatures, QC or study director, external certification and audits. So when you put the whole thing together, so they put the people together with the actions, and the secured sample element is because they're anticipating litigation. They want to prevent fraud. So in this case, what happens is the study director or the person who did the principal investigator will sign a report. The QC director will sign a report that says everything was done according to the process. That's a legal requirement. It's like we'll sign our income tax and it says under penalty of perjury. Well, if the EPA or someone ever went after this company for not having given quality results or having provided fraudulent results, the person who signed that report's up for perjury. And you watch Law and Order, you're going to say he'll roll on the CEO, but you basically have an entree into the organization based upon that signature. Requires frequent calibration, security of the system. SOPs are controlled documents. Controlled documents mean there's only one in the lab. There's only one SOP. To change the SOP, you have to get approvals before the SOP can be changed. So you have control over what documents are being followed by the technicians or whoever else is doing the work. And the sample access is controlled. This is the part that really annoys academics the most because they'd like to think anyone can come in the lab and take a sample who needs it. Why should I have a storeroom, a sample sign in and sign out? So let me compare GLP, ISO, and journal articles. Management is the publisher. We always forget the publisher, but the publisher does guarantee certain things like they'll keep electronic copies or something. Study director is the editor. Principal investigator is the author. Technicians usually not mentioned. Internal QC, peer review. External auditor, impact factor. Why did I choose that journal rather than another journal? More impact or whatever. So GLP has the roles and the responsibilities of science within a legal structure. Now, have I, anything here that I've gone too fast or used a phrase or whatever? I always look to the person who's nodding their head, yes, I'm doing great. But just say, if you go to a court of law, you're going to say, we did all the right things, and this data is either good, or if this data turns out to be fraudulent, we're going to send these people into trial, and we're either going to fine the corporation money for having not followed their own system, or we may go criminally after some of the individuals. So that's a little bit why I think the GLP is more of a anti-fraud. And if you pass this, do it this way, now the question starts being, even though you've done good quality data, I don't know if that's objective or not. That's the second step that you were discussing, Professor Kim.
Fred, do you think these journal versus GLP, they are two totally different paradigm, since you're making analogy, or they are two cultures, or they can, like what Banu said, university can have both journal culture and ISO culture exist?
I think that the academic colleague will respond. I saw a sign at a recent demonstration. What do we want? Evidence-based science. When do we want it? After peer review. I think if you said the GLP, someone coming into your lab and making certain you're following standard procedures, an academic professor would say, that's not what I'm here for. But if you said a peer review group looked over your article, he would say, of course. Some of it is, who is the person, what are they gaining the access to? If you said, well, this is a group gaining you access to publication, they accept it. I think what Banu was saying is, it is what you need to do to gain acceptance for your product. They may say, oh, I understand now. So there's I'd say it's an analogy, but I also think it's a construct that in a court of law or before a jury of our peers, they would say, yeah, they're both science. Now, I mean, a person comes in and says, I have 100 literature citations, or they come in, I have 100 data points that were done by this sort of approach. In that sense, it's, I think the average person would say, that's science. Of course you're supposed to follow standard procedures. Of course it should be reviewed by someone, and therefore less likely to be fraudulent. GLP in the scientific disciplines. By the way, I'm ISO 9000 more than I am GLP, but I understand the GLP situation because I've worked with contract research organizations, so we had to do that selection. What I've noticed is academics don't like it. We create the good laboratory practices. We're on the cutting edge of science. How can you be on the cutting edge of science and have a standard operating procedure? That you get into that argument. We undergo peer review. Well, GLP is a form of peer review. The NIST colleagues don't like it because we measure things to 6 significant figures. What do you mean that's not quality? There's an element there. They say not scientific, too mundane, someone else's job, can't have standard methods at cutting edge science. To me, these are rationalizations. I think the awareness in the medical engineering area that Banu is talking about is a realization that 5 years from now, when this product gets there, I'll have appreciated I did those things earlier, I was alert to those things. But right now, I might want to say these are rationalizations. Industrial toxicologists and regulators love it. Because if it isn't GLP, by an OECD test guidance, I don't have to consider it. Lawyers love it, it's evidence. So you have a transition I think here from what you would say is the research culture of finding new information and knowledge to the legal concept of evidence. And the legal concept of evidence has in it chain of custody. Who had control? Was there attempt for tampering? There's a saying in English common law, let one man go free, let 9 guilty people go free than one man be imprisoned falsely. Well, that's an 11% error rate. They don't want standard deviations, plus or minus 1 standard deviation. That's too vague. They want, the last time the EPA's recent nanomaterial regulation, 7 standard deviations difference. That you can prove in law court. So there's an element here as to what's legal when you get into this regulatory area versus what is standard science. So to me, GLP is doing the type of science that everyone else thought you were always doing and making certain you do it, and you have sign-offs, and now your data is less likely to be fraudulent. You've made honest mistakes, but not deliberate fraudulent mistakes. I think there's problems with this, so I'm going to go on. This is the create structure, submissions to agencies, what should we trust? Now I want to go back to complaints. I was taught in the complaint system there's the voice of the customer, there's the voice of the product, and there's the voice of the process. the voice of the customer is packaging, pricing, variability. You're making me do extra steps I don't really want to do, so forth, and you try and, as a company, satisfy that. The voice of the product is really what the product's performance capabilities are. How long does the computer chip last? If you let it heat up too much, will it now degrade suddenly? What's the gap between what you specify versus what is poor use, and so forth? The voice of the process is the manufacturing process. The process may have variability. I always think of when you watch one of these science fiction films and someone says, let's run the nuclear reactor at 110% of design. Well, the process tells you what happens if you run outside the design envelope. Maybe for your purpose, it's okay. Maybe you've caused higher maintenance costs in the future, but did not cause product performance costs. But the process, the different unit operations that you go through in manufacturing, they also speak in terms of the variability of the product, its capabilities, and so forth. And you need to anticipate that the process may have unexplored influences on the product. Meaning, if you change the process, you may think it's not inconsequential, but it actually does have an impact on the process. So, on the product, that is. So, what happens here, I'm saying, is companies have to set up systems. I'm going into good manufacturing process, GMP right now. They have to have systems in place to protect against unanticipated consequences of a process change. In the management systems I was taught, that's called management of change. So several industries require that if you change a raw material, so my product was silica. If I change the silicon tetrachloride source of my silica, even though I've burned it at 1500 degrees Kelvin, I've caught the particles, I've packed all of it, if I change my raw material supplier to silicon tetrachloride, I'd have to tell my major customers we're changing our raw material. And what they would say is, would you please do a test run and give us a sample of the test run and let us just check it. They're managing their change. Many industries don't understand what the impact is of each step. And my story in this is a little bit not a process change story, but the scuttlebutt in the industry is that General Electric makes industrial diamonds. They take carbon, they squeeze it, and you get diamonds. Turns out, what I'm told, and I had a friend who worked in the abrasive department, said one of those, he didn't deny it, so he must be improving it. Only one supplier provides them the carbon that makes diamonds successfully. Now the question is, do we spend a lot of time figuring out what's so special about this carbon, or do we buy from 3 suppliers so that the one true supplier who's useful never knows that they're in a unique position? We buy from 3, we throw away 2. We've solved our problem without spending all the money on figuring out what exactly is going on. So there's steps that you know you don't understand, and those are what you're trying to control and avoid them leading to unanticipated problems. And for this, very often, people use what's called statistical process control. So controlling your process so you don't have unanticipated problems. It's major in the drug companies, semiconductor chips, large baseload customers, meaning if I sell to an industry that takes 50% of my volume, I'm going to make certain I don't upset them. Small suppliers through a distributor, customers through a distributor, don't care about, they'll have to live with it, they're too small. And basically what I'm saying is I'm managing the process for changes by informing customers, I provide samples, I prefer reversible changes. Oops, there's a problem, we'll go back to the old configuration. Can't do that with a new production facility. Just built something in China. I have to send samples from the Chinese plant to the customer to be certain it meets their performance requirements of the original plant, shall we say. So this is an area of management of change. Now, I like to talk about Intel in this case because everyone says, oh, GMP is terrible. I got all sorts of this and all sorts of that. Well, I sold to Intel. They have a program, you can look it up on their website, it's called Copy Exactly, exclamation point. They trademark the exclamation point. They have high volume production with many discrete steps. They need to minimize variability. They're trying to meet Moore's law more than they're trying to meet other issues like understanding their process. I worked for a German firm. They really didn't like this because they said you really have to understand the chemistry. But the answer is digital randomized control trial. FDA also doesn't know what the impact might be. So in selling to a drug company, I would want to get my silica in during the drug design stage so that it was in the original pilot plant batch, so that it didn't change when it went into full production. And that way it was going to be in there for the 17 or 20 years of patent. And I would have that business for as long as the drug was around. So selling to the industry for drugs is early as possible. Selling to Intel is trying to get in during their production change, meaning from chip A to chip B. They'll let you in for the end of chip A. If there's no problems, you're now in for chip B. So you have a different sell point and a different way of dealing with the people. FDA became extended to excipients, food additives. I already told you Intel and others may do something that's very GMP-like. And it's more of a good practice than a requirement beyond the FDA or beyond those regulatory industries.
What does CGMP stand for?
C stands for chemical.
And the G and the M and the P?
I'm from the chemical industry, so ours was more, CGMP would be more the manufacture of the ingredients. I was an ingredient supplier. So, and then the drug formulation, they bring in all the ingredients and they create the drug formula that you're actually going to swallow. And my industry was the excipient, which is the carrier. So on a aspirin tablet, there's maybe only 250 milligrams of active material. The rest of the tablet is an excipient, something that carries the drug to your stomach, falls apart, allows the drug to be released.
So does the GMP part stand for good manufacturing practice?
Correct.
Okay.
Just like it's good laboratory practice, and it has the same problem that everyone says, I do good practice. I don't need to be told how to do it. But this is a rigorous system so that you avoid inadvertent changes. Now, I said earlier, there's times when you need to impose rules to prevent fraud or whatever. There's other times when the rules stopping you from doing good science. And so I'm going to move a little bit into the rules stopping you from good science, because I think sometimes it goes up right away and sometimes it doesn't. I think all of us would want to be certain that the FDA has good data, not fraudulent data. We'd like them to control. I don't want to be defined. I don't want my chemotherapy drug to turn out that they changed something in the process and it lost its effectiveness. I'd rather pay for that stability of the process. It's a good thing, and I'm going to start arguing it gets overdone in certain situations. So this is the Climmer score, and this is what many FDA-type regulators use to decide whether or not something submitted to them should be considered. It was proposed by industry. It's somewhat reasonable, you know. Bless you. If you're a toxicologist, I guess it's reasonable. It's intended to bring order. Everyone wants to know that what the regulator's thought process is so that they understand how their input will be valued. It emphasizes guideline studies, and according to GLP, there's a sharp drop-off when you go from reliability stage 2 to reliability stage 3. This score, the idea is you take all your papers or your sub-studies, and then you start scoring them, and presumably if you have a reliability of 1, weight of evidence, you really trust that. If you got a reliability 4, you say, I can't use that in my process. This favors everything is going to be a standard technique, usually an OECD technical guidance or an EPA or FDA one, that's going to be done by GLP. That's the best score that you can get on this. My argument is going to be sometimes that is not science. That might be what regulators like to do, but it's not science. And for that, I want to discuss one chemistry controversy. I know Paul Westerhoff, and he is a water and wastewater engineer, Arizona State University. He donates his time to people like Friends of the Earth and others to evaluate some of their concerns. And he was working on nanotitanium dioxide, doesn't get through the waste treatment plant, and he noticed that in the local Salt River near Tempe. During the summertime, the titanium dioxide goes up because everyone's wearing sunscreens in the sunny day, and more of it's in the water that goes to the waste treatment plant, but none of it made it to the river. So efficiency of the wastewater treatment plant relative to nanoparticles entering the environment. Did a great job. He decided, I'm going to look at food grade titanium dioxide. Now, I don't know if you know, but skim milk has white pigments added to it to make it look white. It didn't have that done, it would have a bluish cast to it. So they used titanium dioxide, which is E171 is its official designation. It's food grade. You can also use calcium phosphate. There's a couple of different items, but it's a cosmetic. And so he decided to look at it, and he found that, and I have my notations down here, he made a number of observations, made some calculations about what the ingestion was, and he concluded that 36% of the particles were less than 100 nanometers. Europe uses 50% less than 100 nanometers as its official definition of a nanomaterial. I noticed it, I thought it was interesting. I thought the rest of his paper was a jumble of things that I didn't really think he was expert on. That's life, that's science, we learn. But a year or two later, David Warheit, who I know from DuPont, published a paper, 4 samples, OECD protocols, followed by a discussion of the Westerhoff work. And look at the type of phraseology that was used by industry to describe the chemical results of Paul Westerhoff. Flawed, non-relevant materials. They're trying to dominate the landscape and influence the regulator. Paul Westerhoff is never going to be at the EPA or the FDA. He's not trying to influence anyone. It's David Warheit is trying to influence. It's one of those, he knows what he's trying to do, he can see it. The interesting is that DuPont doesn't sell food-grade titanium dioxide. They didn't do this for their own product. They did this to admonish the academic scientists that you're not allowed to speculate in our area. And the reason they did that, I don't want to say they did it just for ill will, but the reason they did it is that the worst case to industry is some academic scientist makes some broad conclusions about a new but related material using a new protocol, a non-standard material, a non-standard species, and creates a flurry, a problem that takes years to resolve. So what had happened in this case, another case of fullerene, another nanomaterial, a professor in, I think she was in northern Texas, she decided to try fullerenes. She put them into water using THF. She killed a lot of fish. It turned out it was the THF that was killing the fish, not the fullerene. If she had been using GLP, she would never have published this article because they would have forced her to check the vehicle. But because they don't do GLP, this made it out. She caused a whole bunch of problems. It took 2 years for people to resolve the problems. And even today, in 2016, the Congressional Research Office cited the wrong article as still current, not the correct article. So the reason that the reaction from the industry was so vociferous was they felt they were falling into this trap. Now, should I stop at this point, or?
Yeah, I think there are some are catching
Yeah.
trend.
No, go ahead.
But I'd like to take a few questions. Yeah.
How expensive is it to actually follow GLP for a normal lab?
The expenses in is the idea that expense to set it up.
Yeah.
Once it's set up, it's like any other system that if you went to a company, you would be said, here's the procedures you want to follow when you do this type of test. I think what it is that if you deviate from the test, where an academic scientist might do, you would have to write down that I know I'm deviating from the test so that you separated that test result from the other fully conforming GLP. You remember at one of the early ones, I said the QC person who signs the report has to say were any modifications made to the protocol or any deviations noted. Well, you would have to do something similar if you were the academic scientist. The other area would be that you might be forced to have access control to where your samples were stored. So I recommended it to a number of people because I said, if you say you publish a paper, the EPA says interesting, you said, and by the way, it was done by GLP, they have to really listen to you. But the colleagues say, no, no, no. It's almost a visceral, you can't tell me how to do quality. I have a PhD.
So what Fred said actually kind of led us back to this notion of objectivity and science and what actually, we tend to believe science and we tend to kind of think naively once science gets produced, reproducibility, objective knowledge could be made. But what he just said, like the sporine case and kill the fish, this and that, actually shows you that no, not necessarily. A lot of time, what our academic produce, to what extent we can call it scientific truth, and that kind of get back to our very original question about the construction of objectivity. Apparently, objectivity construction is a very expensive enterprise. Right? You need all of this. Fred used constantly this management about what? A lot of it's about people. Compliance. It's people. Are you willing to do it? How can I check, constantly checking your profile, your documents. So that is why, the whole notion of objectivity, hard facts making, reproducibility, don't take it just for granted that, I do a measurement, if I calibrate my instrument, I can. No, there's a whole business about how people claiming objectivity, how people maintaining objectivity, how people maintaining the management. GLP case is like, people don't want to get sued, people want to protect their business, people don't want to generate data that could be later on questioned by the court. So they are adopting all these procedures. Well, the point of today is we are now opening this kitchen. Now you see what's happening in the kitchen, right? And Fred, think of him chef, whatever, or.
Well, let's just put it this way. I would put it. The sous chef doesn't have to be GLP, but maybe the chef does, right? I mean, there's a certain element of where in this process you start saying, I'm going to do GLP, or any standard procedure. Sometimes it's just for your own protection, like an Ava Oberdorfer would have been. Other times, it's a way of preventing error. So if in this case, the peer review didn't pick it up. It's a help to be guaranteed and assured. It helps, but it can also be used as a filter, which is what Professor Koo was saying earlier. If you have good data, but you didn't do by GLP, the rat's still dead. The observation's still true. Scientists will believe you, but not the regulators. So there's a filtering effect that can occur also that you have to be careful about. And if you realize it takes 8 to 12 years to get a standard procedure done by the OECD, you could say, well, they're always kind of behind the times. So how do I make my temporary procedure on the way to being a standard look good for regulators? And that may be you go to an ASTM, you make it a standard, and you at least have a stepping stone to what will later be accepted by the OECD.
That kind of brings to the point I want to, connecting GLP standardization to responsibility. A lot of time we scientists make a claim. We want to be innovator. We make this crazy claim, but like Fred just said, if you don't follow certain rules, a lot of time you could be create a false claim. And so that kind of get back to this notion of scientific integrity. A lot of time we don't want to lie, but it's just our practice kind of lead us to different, to the false conclusion. But also remember, you see many people got involved from those case studies, right? FDA got involved, industry got involved, many different parties got involved. So who should say this is the right procedure to do? GLP is probably a well accepted protocol. People tend to, industry people, regulate tend to embrace it. But, in academia, not so much. And not even